Welcome back to Garden Studio. I'm Tessa Pinner, a designer and gardener in upstate South Carolina, Zone 8A. In today's video, I'll take you behind the scenes for a new project that's on my design desk. This is a new home build, so I'll start by showing you the plans of the house, the architectural renderings that I was given, and I will run that into my approach to researching and to getting my mind around the setting and the historical context that the garden needs to occupy. Finally, I'll show you my initial concept renderings and explain some of my thought processes behind the choices that I made. So here you can see the front facade of the house. My first cue that this is a French-inspired house is the roof line. It's a very steeply pitched hip roof, and this is very typical of French country houses. It's one of the roof lines used most commonly on a traditional French home. Second cue is the arched dormer windows. So that roof line is something you would see very typically in Paris on a French country house. It's just classically French more than any other architectural style. And then the windows, the arched windows, the arched doors, those can be several different traditions, but in combination with the rest of it, primary cues are going French. And this is a pretty large house. It's about 6,000 square feet. So thinking about the mass, the size of the house, the way it is raised up because of the grade of the land. And so it sits up quite a bit. And this gives it even more sense of grandeur, honestly. So all of these are cues for me to know how I am going to need to balance this out with the landscape. This next view shows some isometric perspectives of the house. You can get a sense of the massing, what the back looks like. I love it when architects do this and provide these models. They build them in a 3D rendering software and then export the views that basically give a drone view, as if you were a bird up in the air flying around and getting a sense really for how the house is sitting and what the different parts of the house do, how they relate to each other. And this shows the back view, it shows the side views, and you get a sense of how the land is sloping up into the main body of the house. If for some reason you are unsure of the style of house that you actually have and you're looking at your own architecture and wondering how to make sense of it, I will just give you a quick overview of this book that I keep in my reference library for this exact reason. I find roof lines and house massing, as well as dormer and window and door style, to be very helpful in determining what kind of house you have. If you are like me, you have a house built in the mid-century but not in any specific style, or my house is a little bit of a mongrel, what styles is it pulling from? Something like this Field Guide to American Houses could be a helpful thing to check out of the library or buy a used copy on Amazon so that you can learn a little bit more if you are interested in rooting the garden or landscape at your own house in the style of the architecture. Which, having seen the house design, you can understand why I immediately went to this book. Is a classic, Landscape Design, Cultural and Architectural History, and I immediately went to the section on French garden design. Now, not to dive into the fine points too far, but essentially the French garden design, the way we think of it now, it is all rooted in the Renaissance and classical principles that came out of Italy. So the way the French took that is they basically expanded it, made it slightly less fussy in its ornamentation, and French gardens emphasize axial geometry, sight lines, control of the landscape. You can see here, these are just classical, very famous examples of 1600s French, very famous French gardens. Of course, one of the most famous of those is Versailles. We've got, these big vistas very formal geometric layouts. The challenge with a French inspired house is how do we honor the architecture? So you can see this is obviously a different flavor of house. It's extremely grand, but you have those kind of arched dormer windows. You have this sort of viewing terrace with the balustrades, and you're looking out over something geometric. And this is not necessarily the most habitable space. If you have ever been to a grand French garden, you know you probably want to go early in the morning or at dusk, or definitely not in the middle of the summer because there's no shade in the middle of the garden and it is hot and quite austere. I think this is gorgeous. The cone shape, very typical, very tightly clipped, elaborate patterning is extremely typical of a chateau garden. So, as you can see, one of my biggest challenges as a designer is figuring out how to marry this historical precedent, the visual language and the architectural references that the house is presenting me with the program the client has asked for. Basically, what is their wish list in considering what's the budget, what are the site constraints, what is the role of maintenance in a garden like this, just marrying the practicality of a garden for today's client with this historical reference with the French country estate. Next up, I'll show you how I have attempted to do just that. The very first thing that I did when laying out the bones of this garden was to reflect the geometry of the house out into the landscape. So I did this with an axial line coming straight out the front door. I took the outline of the front steps and reflected it in a mirror image in what is essentially a hedged courtyard. There is an idea with houses and house settings called an envelope of space. When you have a house of very distinct character, you need the envelope of space around the house to dovetail with it. So the setting for this house, the broader setting, is actually the woods of Tennessee. We have a little bit of tension between the style of the house and its surrounding landscape. So the envelope of space with a house like this, its immediate environment becomes very important for setting the context correctly. It actually helps us to provide a box. So that's exactly what I've done with this entry courtyard sequence. And I do really like the ellipse here because it balances all of the square. And you can see I went through a couple of versions of how the planting goes. I'm in conversations with the client now about whether we want the large trees or we want the opening straight up to the house to be all very clear in the sight lines. And this is where the nuance of how do we make the cues of French garden work for these clients. It is actually the largest open space that they're going to have. I expect they'll entertain out here in the front because they don't have as much room in the back. And if they have a large party, it's going to spill out into the front. So it's not going to be the typical suburban arrangement where you don't use the front yard. There's a long winding driveway that approaches. Basically, the minute you enter into the gate, you are in a designed garden. So we have repetition of trees, we have some sort of beautiful water feature, just enough manicured and tightly clipped planting to give you that visual cue. We're looking at a French garden here. It's not so much that it's going to be an overwhelming maintenance issue for them. Now, the back is a totally different ballgame. The very intimate size of this pool courtyard, essentially, we're working with a very large retaining wall that is holding back the hillside behind it. And one of the challenges with a really large wall is how to either disguise it or make it work for you. And so I have decided to build in a structure to the wall. So essentially we have one wall of a building already. What if we either make it a trellis or a fully enclosed pavilion opposite the pool that you look out over that gives your eye a reward. And same with the other end of the pool. That'll be intimate seating and very lush planting. These views should help give a flavor of how those spaces will feel and just how different the character of the spaces will be. Certain of the details will correspond. There will be some clipped and formal elements that we pulled to the back spaces, but it doesn't need to be nearly as formal. Because the spaces are smaller, we can have more interesting, fun, colorful planting. And these are things that are meant to be viewed up close. You're brushing the lavender as you walk by it. You're sitting in the middle of the flowers. This is not so much a garden to be viewed as a garden to be in. I always do a Pinterest board for projects like this because I find there is no better way to make sure we are talking about the same visual language than to show pictures. People have different feelings about Pinterest, but for me, it's a very helpful conversation tool early on in the design process. We start with images and then we leave them behind and we depart and we do our own thing, but they help map the course for the country we're going to. Our next step is to take into account any revisions based on house footprint changes, conversations with the client about what they like and what they don't like about this particular version, and then looking at specific plants and materials. So we start big and we get more and more specific as we move through the design process. I hope this was just a fun peek behind the scenes at my process and how the very early stages of looking at big picture on a new garden design actually works. Hope you all have a great week in your own gardens.